Give people a couple more seconds to join here. All right, we're going to get started. Hello and welcome to the third of 6 New York Forward Capacity Building webinars. My name is Stefan Lutter. I'm a revitalization specialist with the New York Department of State. I'm joined today by my colleagues Melissa Keller-Popsise and Rachel Bruce. Through Governor Hochul's launch of New York Forward, the success of DRI is being brought to smaller downtowns and kickstarting revitalization across every region of the state. The application for the second round of New York Forward has been announced with $100 million available in funding. Like the DRI, New York Forward communities develop a strategic investment plan and compile catalytic projects that build toward a community vision for revitalized downtown. As a reminder for those applying, these are the important dates for this year's application. The intent to apply will be due on August 18th, that's tomorrow. The link to the intent to apply form can be found within the DRI New York Forward application guidebook. It's not mandatory, but communities can take advantage of one-on-one technical assistance with their application by completing this form. Forms submitted after the deadline do not guarantee technical assistance, but we have had a lot of interest in this, so be sure to get your form in as soon as possible. Applications are due via the CFA portal for all regions except New York City on September 29th at 4 p.m. And for New York City, applications must be emailed to your borough president office by September 8th at 4 p.m. Applications cannot and will not be accepted after the deadline. These 6 educational webinars aim to help New York Forward communities understand the basics of downtown revitalization planning. Whether you intend to apply for New York Forward this year or are interested in learning where to start, these webinars will help communities build capacity needed to take on important planning initiatives. For the course of these webinars, you'll be better equipped to apply for New York funding and indeed carry out the New York Forward planning process if you are awarded. Please note that these webinars were recorded last year and are currently on the DOS website, but they include some irrelevant references to previous dates and times. So please see the screen here for those dates, the current dates and times. Once these reprised webinars are re-recorded, they'll be uploaded to the site to mitigate any date confusion and include the updated questions. During the webinar, please submit all questions as they arise into the chat box, and we'll answer questions at the end of today's webinar. All questions received during the 6 webinar series will be compiled and posted as an FAQ on the Capacity Webinar website. On Tuesday, we talked about community visioning and public engagement. Today's webinar will discuss undertaking a community needs assessment that starts to build goals that work toward that vision. So I'm going to stop sharing. Again, just a reminder to put the questions in the chat, and we will answer them at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back here. So a community needs assessment. Let's start off by just defining what is this document? What is its purpose? What does it include? Well, ideally, a CNA, a community needs assessment, is a document that is filled with graphics and data and maps and summaries that reveal and measure the needs of a community and serve as a communication tool, something that your entire community can review and really acknowledge as being a faithful record of where they are today as a community and what they are aspiring for, what they need in multiple aspects of their life. Now, there are many different types of organizations that may undertake a CNA. Local governments, transit agencies, hospitals, schools, social service organizations. But when local governments, such as yourselves, undertake it, They typically take on a comprehensive approach, and they cover housing and economics and transportation needs and the social service needs, environmental needs, cultural, recreational. And all of these needs, the composite of them, they obviously interact with each other. There's not just a silo defining, a housing need separate from a transportation need, but collectively, they start to create a vision of what is the future of that community, what the residents would like that future to be about. You're going to notice that I didn't say anything about land use. I didn't say land use and development needs. And I want you to imagine yourselves, you're at a dinner party maybe with your neighbors and you're having a conversation about the future of your neighborhood. Is your neighbor going to look to you and say, well, what sort of land use needs do we need? They're likely not going to say that. But they might say, I wish we could have more housing that looks like this. I wish that we had more jobs that were closer to home. I wish we were better connected to this place. I wish that our town or our village would provide X service. Oh, it would be amazing if we had more basketball courts, or what would happen if we had a movie theater, or if we had some type of community center. These are the types of ways that people think about their needs. And our purpose in the CNA is to catalog those needs. And it's from that catalog, from that inventory, that we'll then begin to understand, well, what are the types of land uses? What are the types of projects that would actually be in service of those needs? So we take an approach that's perhaps different from the way a developer might think about. They come to a community, they see a site, they have in mind a particular type of land use. Maybe it's a commercial office building, maybe it's a mixed use building, and they attach that development concept to a site and then move forward and frame it in terms of revitalization planning. Here we're starting differently. Here we are starting with the community's articulation of their needs, and we are looking at it holistically. And then once we've done that, then we start trying to marry sites with development concepts, a topic that we will address in our future webinars on placemaking and on projects. So 4 learning objectives for today. First, I want to make sure you all understand the technical process for generating a CNA. For some of you here, you might be planning directors, and this will be completely intuitive, and you may have already done one. Others, you may have never heard of the concept of a CNA, and this will be the first time you are encountering a methodology for it. As part of this, I'm going to identify all of the different types of attributes that could be included within a CNA, and I'm going to direct you to the sources that are available for free where you can quickly find that data. And then lastly, I want to make sure that everyone who attends this webinar can see the link between the data and community needs. It's not worthwhile collecting data for the sake of collecting data if we aren't able to then make interpretations of that data to understand the needs of the community. So this is not necessarily an easy task. 6 challenges that come up routinely in the production of a CNA. There is some work involved, and there is some technical skill required to execute the data analysis and the mapping. You might be starting from scratch. You may not have any record of a community's needs, or you might be new to the community. You may be a leader in the community, but have only lived there for a couple of years. And so that's a challenge. What about the boundaries of the revitalization area? What is the area that you are trying to improve? You may not know what that area is. And then when you're analyzing that area, how do you get data that fits that area? It may not be a perfect match. Not all of the data that's out there speaks to needs. You can't address all needs through data, so you might have to think about sources that are non-quantitative. And lastly, remember that your needs assessment is simply that. It's a record of the needs. It's not a policy document. It's not a placemaking strategy. It's not a list of projects or actions. It's not an implementation plan. And so there's going to be a next step, and you want to design the assessment so that it leads you to the next step. You want to package that document in a way that it really serves as a tool for going forward on the other steps of the revitalization process that Tiffany described earlier. So with those being the challenges, what do you do? Well, I outline 6 steps for generating a CNA. And I'm going to go through each of them over the course of this presentation. The first step being generating a ready-made community profile, engaging your community in a brainstorm session on needs, proceeding to define the revitalization area and then the analysis area, collecting different types of data, and I'm going to show you what are those types of data, and then generating the report. So let's begin. Let's go through these processes. So first of all, I just want to remind you that there's a lot of sources that you may already have, and I covered that in the first webinar, comprehensive plans, housing studies, ED strategies. So remember from that first webinar, gather your documents, or the analogy that was used, open the fridge and see what you have. And also take a look and see if your community, your locality, your county already has a geographic information site that allows for mapping and accessing data. And then keep this slide 11 close to you, because these are all of your links to easy, available, free sources of information. And I just really want to reassure the non-technical folks in this webinar that these links are to data platforms that are very user-friendly. And while there may be some ramp up in terms of doing a training webinar to get used to them, very quickly, within anywhere from a few minutes to an hour, you'll be a pro at accessing information from these sites, generating maps, and including them within your community needs assessment. And as I go through the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to be referencing these different data sources, but just know that they're all here for you to come back to, and here's where you can link to them. Okay, step 1, take the shortcut. Use what's already there in terms of existing community profiles, which you can do from the US Census site. All you really do is you go to the data portal for the US Census, you put in the name of your community, and poof, you will get an instant community profile. It'll feature information on population, income levels, education. It's really handy as a starting point. Now, maybe you don't have a planner on staff, or maybe you don't have an administrative assistant on staff who can undertake the CNA. So just being able to quickly access a community profile, and I put the link on this slide so you can see how to generate this type of profile, is a great way to get started. But even if you are ambitious and have the capacity to do a full community needs assessment, I would still say starting with the auto report, these ready-made reports from the US Census, is one of the best way just to get your bearings, to understand the geography, the boundaries of your community, who your neighbors are, and roughly from a diagnostic perspective, from a quantitative perspective, where you are today. Step 2, brainstorm with your community on needs. So you know from the previous webinar that there is some engagement that happens around visioning. And as part of that engagement effort, there is also a finer grain conversation that can take place on needs, where you ask the community specifically, what are you hoping for? What are you missing? What are the gaps? What do you need? Even before you start going through all of those links and going through all of the GIS sites and poring over data, it's really helpful to just have an open conversation, and maybe it leads to a word cloud like here, where you've got an understanding of what are the types of needs that keep on coming up in your conversations with community. You can do this a lot of different ways. You can do it through an online Zoom town hall. You could do it through an in-person workshop. You could do it through a walking tour open to everyone of the community. You could do it through a survey. But what you most want to come away with is really a laundry list of all the different things that are coming up and an identification of what are the ones that are coming up most often and strike people as most important. This is going to do a few things. First of all, it's going to help you better understand what might be the boundaries of the revitalization area. Just in the process of people verbalizing what their needs are, you might get a window into what are the primary geographic units that need to be addressed. The second thing is that the folks you speak to may bring to you information sources you're not aware of. It's not uncommon through a brainstorming session for you to suddenly discover that a social service agency did a focus group last year, or they conducted a survey, or there's a homeowners association that has a great distribution list for folks to invite to future meetings. You'll find out the lay of the land. You'll find out more about who your community leaders are just by who participates in the process. So that's the second piece here. And then the last piece, of course, is like I mentioned earlier, it's going to give you a preview of what the needs are. It's going to tell you what to look for when you undertake the data collection process. Step 3, define the revitalization area. So the map on the left here is from an actual downtown revitalization initiative that was done for the village of Ossining. And the boundary of the DRI revitalization area that was subject to revitalization planning is in that thicker blue line. And what were the factors that led to this area being designated for the more focused community planning, including the needs assessment? Well, this is where people are. This area here is where you're going to see in the village the greatest concentration of people, the most amount of street traffic, the greatest convergence of different buildings, the intensity of buildings, their density, the mixed residential, commercial buildings. It includes the Main Street, the historic Main Street of the community. It includes the Metro North rail station for the village of Ossining. Sites that have been long considered viable for development are within here. And it's proximate to the banks of the Hudson River. It's right on top of it. So I list here some factors. And when you and your colleagues and your community residents and your business owners huddle together and you talk about defining the revitalization area, these are the factors that are most likely going to shape the way people think about the appropriate area for revitalizing. But just because you've done this, just because you've defined that revitalization area, doesn't mean that your job is over in terms of defining geography. You still have to find data that fits this area. This is kind of a weird geographic shape. And it's very unlikely when you get a geographic shape like this one between the blue lines that you're going to have data that pertains only to what falls inside that blue line. So you're going to have to get it as good as you possibly can. And what I like to do is use the census site, the US Census site, and look at my community using the mapping tools to really understand what are all of the different geographic units I have available. And they're at different scales. They're at the county level, at the place level, at the village level, the town level, census tracts, census block groups. If you've never used the census before, have no fear. There's a wonderful webinar that will navigate you through the different options, show you how to master those geographic units. And then, as we did for Ossining, we looked at the boundaries of the entire village, and that was too big. And then we found a census tract, 133, and that census tract, which is here, was bigger than the revitalization area, but at least it included all the revitalization area. And I know that this census tract is going to pick up data that's outside my revitalization area, but it's the closest fit. And so this becomes my analysis area. Now we're ready. Now we're ready to start collecting data. So there's two types of data that we're going to collect. We're going to collect just characteristic data, data that's about the community, demographic, socioeconomic composition. Then we're going to collect data on the needs of the community related to housing and economics, transportation, recreation, culture, and the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not yet going to collect any information on land use. We're going to fixate on what people need. And if you want a webinar that will make it very easy for you to understand how to use the census website to collect that data, it's less than an hour. I provide the link here. And after you watch that, you will be a pro at navigating the US Census site. There are other types of census data aggregation sites. And in the past, sometimes I've recommended folks to use those sites instead of the census. But the census has updated its data portal. And along with the update, it's also provided some really wonderful training webinars. So getting up to speed on it, the investment time to really be able to navigate that on your own without hiring a consultant is relatively short, and I encourage you to give it a try. Now what I'm going to do is walk you through examples of data attributes. And I'm going to show you how each of the slides is structured. I provide you with an example of some type of graphic or data, and I put it within one of the themes that we've talked about, demographics, socioeconomics, or housing. Then I identify where that source is from, and you can always go back to that earlier slide I showed you with the listing of the sources and the links to be able to access that source. And then I provide you here with a little bubble, just sort of linking the data to what it means in terms of community needs. I'm telling you this because this webinar is going to be effective for you in real time in this particular moment, but hopefully also as a reference point as you look through these slides and as you go through them. And we're not going to have time to go into depth dissecting each and every single one of these slides to great degree, but I want to empower you to be able to look at these slides on your own and ask yourself, is this relevant to my community? Why is it relevant? Where did it come from? How might I also use this slide as a model for doing a similar type of assessment for my community? So let's dive in. Population data. Perfect place to start. You can get this data from the American Community Survey, or you can get it from 2020 decennial data. Quickly, what's the difference between these two data sources? Well, they're both housed on the data site for the US Census. They both provide a broad range of demographic and socioeconomic and housing information, but they come from different sources. The American Community Survey is an annual, more limited sampling of the population, and it's done each year. And then the data is presented sometimes as a 1-year time point, but oftentimes as an average of 5 years together. And it's not asking everyone, it's a smaller sample, but the decennial data, which is done every 10 years, is a broad census that's really aiming to maximize participation. And that data set allows especially for comparisons over the 10-year marks. We now are lucky enough to have many, if not all of the metrics for the 2020 decennial census, and great to compare that to 2010. I use both. I use the American Community Survey and the decennial data. And even though it's 2022, and even though we have 2020 data available to us for both the ACS and the decennial data, I use both because the ACS data really allows for comparisons over a more granular period of time. As you can see here, I'm comparing the 5-year averages for population for 2006 to 2010. and using those 5-year averages across time up until 2014, 2018. If you're confused by this, don't forget the link I mentioned earlier about collecting data. It'll go into much greater depth on the different data sources and how to make sense of them. What matters here is that there's population data that is available from the census. And this population data is useful to us because it helps us to understand whether or not a community is growing, oftentimes an indication of economic health, or if it's shrinking, oftentimes an indication of some fundamental economic needs that are going unresolved. And population data is also looked at carefully by the development community. So how they perceive the market viability of a community is also going to depend on whether or not they see that community growing or contracting. It's a very important statistic. I would recommend that you look at your population trends from both American Community Survey and decennial data. They're not going to match up perfectly, but just knowing what that gap is and knowing how things have changed over time is helpful. Also helpful is comparing the data not only across different scales of time, as has been done in this graphic, but also across different geographies. How are your neighboring communities performing in terms of population? Has there been significant growth in the county population, but perhaps contraction in your own village or town? Start speculating why is that the case, and it'll start to reveal some needs too. Okay. Also housed within the census is household data. This is great. It lets you know how many households you have that are consisting of families with children under 18. It lets you know how many single parents you have, how many people are living by themselves, and all of these different types of households have unique household needs. So grab that information and begin to think about the different types of households you have in your community. And you might also want to take a look at how they have changed over time. Age data is great, also from the census. It can be really helpful to know, are your seniors growing in your population? Are you losing your young people? Are they growing up, leaving the community and not coming back? Do you have more families with children? And all of these statistics are really helpful. They may reveal needs about the school district. They may signal some concerns about housing affordability and the difficulty of younger folks to come back to the community and find housing. They may reveal some unique needs that seniors have in terms of their capacity to age in place. And the starting point for understanding all those particularities is to look at your age data. Similarly, you would also want to look at the breakdown of your community according to race and ethnicity, as I've done here using US Census data, comparing the racial composition of the city of Newburgh with Orange County. Because when you have this racial data, then you can better understand what is the degree of cultural diversity in your community? How might that diversity be shaping your retail base? How might it be shaping your cultural institutions? What is the relationship between the racial composition of your community and the surrounding areas? What does it reveal in terms of the level of racial integration within your community and compared against the broader geography? And also, how might racial data be a starting point for understanding greater disparities related to housing access or employment? So do grab this data, do compare it, look at it over time, and think about how it could be enlisted to look at equity issues and disparities for resource access that are occurring along the lines of racial or ethnic identification. Let's move on to socioeconomic data. You can grab from the census median household income. It's very helpful to know how over time incomes have been changing. They reveal how a community may need greater attention in terms of being able to access certain growth areas within the economy. I also like household income data to be done at a finer grain level, looking at the census tracts, the smaller analytical units within a community, so that I can see, as I can see here, where are the parts of my community that are least socioeconomically blessed? For example, here, within the city of Newburgh, Census Tract 4's median household income was just shy of 27,000, about a third of what it is in its county of Orange County. So that asymmetry, that disparity between one particular census tract and the surrounding area may signal a higher level of need for economic mobility options within that particular part of the city. Similarly, I would also grab poverty data. This is an imperfect statistic. I mean, basically, it's recording the percentage of households that are living below the federal poverty line, as I've shown you here for the city of Newburgh, based upon different racial categories. And there's a lot that could be said about the limitations of the crude measures of a federal poverty line in terms of it not accounting for the full cost of living that includes things like transportation and food and healthcare costs and the difficulty of using a federal poverty line when we know the cost of living varies so much from place to place in part of the country. I still encourage you to grab it because it allows you to compare how different groups, here I did it according to race, but you can do it with households, you can do it with age, you can do it with gender, are experiencing poverty according to this metric in varying ways. And again, that helps you go deeper. It helps you understand how different sub-communities within your locality may be differentially experiencing poverty, may be in a different socioeconomic place. Sources of income, also a data set from the census, reveals the degree to which your residents may be using supplemental sources of revenue, whether that be Social Security or cash assistance, helps to create a more robust profile of the household economics at play within your community. How one is well positioned for certain jobs within your community or within the broader region may dependent on the maximum amount of education they've achieved. And so I like to analyze data from the US Census that lets me know the percentage of the community that has a bachelor's degree or other types of degree, and I can compare that information against what's happening, at the city level or at the county level, and begin to consider differential needs in terms of employment depending on where someone is living. And similarly, I also want to look at high school graduation rates, a data set which isn't accessed to the same level of precision in the US Census as it is from our State Department of Education's data portals, and New York has a great one. Link is back on that earlier slide I showed you, I think it's slide 11. And what's great is like it lets you get a window into how there are different high school graduation rates for different groups based on gender, based on English as a first language or a second language, based on race. And if you're in a community where you have a lot of concerns about long-term economic mobility, studying this data, understanding how different groups are matriculating to college or not can be helpful. So we've gone through the community characteristics. We've gone through demographics and socioeconomics. Finally, we get to needs, and we're going to start with housing needs. So this is a data set on the type of housing units from the census, and it shows what are the percentage of the total housing units that consist of single family homes versus smaller multifamily buildings versus larger multifamily buildings with more than 10 units. And this is a great data set for being able to identify where your community might be missing certain types of housing. Even though the single family home might be the default desire for parts of your community, there may be an outstanding need for more apartments and or even for what we call middle housing, buildings with 2 to 10 units. And looking at the data, seeing what you've got and comparing it to what other parts of your broader community have, as we've done here, comparing unincorporated Mamaroneck to the entire town to Westchester, can be really helpful. It can also be helpful in terms of seeing within the region who is contributing a greater share of multifamily housing and which communities are more predominantly single family in nature. Building age is also a statistic that you can get from the census and break it down to understand the percentage of total housing units that were constructed long ago. We did this for the city of Newburgh in Orange County and learned that 61% of the housing units in Newburgh were constructed before 1940. And this type of data can really speak to what might be the needs for housing rehabilitation and maintenance. It's not the only statistic that speaks to housing conditions. You're also going to want to look at vacancy data and building violations, information which you probably want to get from your building departments, especially if they have a really good real property management system that can kick out reports. But collectively, what you're trying to get at here with data like age or vacancy or a building violation is the condition of buildings and what they need to be in a state of good repair, high quality places for living. Rental data that you can get from the census is a mixed bag. What it's basically showing you, as in this graph here, is the median gross rent over time. But this is everyone, right? And so it's not bad. It might show you like a steady increase over time in the median gross rent. Of course, you're going to want to adjust this for changes in the value of money and inflation. What it doesn't really tell you is what's on the market right now should someone decide to move, whether they're an existing resident or a newcomer, right? Because this is the median rent that everyone's paying who's a renter. So this is why, along with this data, I do like to take a look at the data for the apartments that are on the market, that are available, because this really tells me, well, what happens when someone is going out on the market looking for housing? So I pulled this off the Zillow Rental Manager site. It's a very handy site, and it shows you what's housed within Zillow in terms of apartments that are available for rent. This is limited too, because not all units are going to show up on these listing sites, like even though they may be on the market. And there's many of them. There's Trulia and there's Zillow, there's 3D, there's many different types of sites. There isn't a perfect one. And so what I would suggest to you, if you're trying to get a handle on the housing rental market, is to talk to brokers and talk to a variety of brokers and interview them about the types of properties that are coming up for rent, what the rents are that are being asked for, and what are the rents that ultimately are being contracted, and how are the rents changing over time depending on the part of your community or the type of unit, studios versus 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms. What are people who are searching for housing coming to the brokers and asking for? And that qualitative information, those observations, are going to go a long way for you understanding what might be the housing needs with your renter population. What you can do from the census that is handy is evaluate the level of cost burden for all of the renters in your community. And what do I mean by cost burden? I mean the percentage of a household's income that is used for housing costs is greater than 30%. And so in this graphic here, I'm looking in the city of Newburgh at the percentage of households here that are cost burdened within each of the census tracts. What share of all of the households are paying more than 30% of their income toward housing? And being able to see this cost burden across different geographic units, whether at the census tract level or the city versus the county level, can help you understand the differential needs for more affordable housing in different parts of the city and the region. It's not a perfect statistic because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, housing costs in tandem with transportation costs, in tandem with health insurance costs, all stack up to determine what is the cost of living. And we don't get to all of that, but comparatively, it's still a useful metric to include in your CNA. Home ownership levels, also in the census, great statistic, not only because they show you, the percentage of households who are homeowners and across different groups, whether they be race or gender or age, but also because besides showing, the share of households that have secured housing that, that belongs to them. And so they're not going to lose because of changes in the market or because of displacement or gentrification effects. It also shows you the percentage of households that maybe be building wealth through the acquisition of homes and able to pass on that wealth through the form of real property to the next generation. And in analyzing this data, it may reveal to you the need for more homeownership opportunities or counseling or some of the obstacles that are happening for different groups from being able to become homeowners. It also might reveal to you the importance of targeting a lot of your energy toward addressing the cost issues for renters because they may form the overwhelming majority of your population base. So lots of different ways to interpret homeownership data, but it's an important stat to include within the CNA. So unlike the rental values, which you discerned probably that I'm a bit skeptical about with the sources we have, I think we do have some pretty good information on the median sales prices for housing at the local level. And you can ask a real estate broker to run a report for you because they have access to multiple listing service databases that will list all the transactions. Or you can go to the Redfin data center, the link of which is on that slide of sources, and it'll show you over time, as this graphic does here, the fluctuations in the median sales prices for a particular community. You can do more than that. You can export the data for the actual specific transactions, see what the year the building was built, see what the square footage is, the number of bedroom units. You can get a lot of information online. And I think this really helps to show how your real estate market for housing may be changing. Is it really hot? Is it gentrifying? Or is it possible you may be in a market that still hasn't recovered from the Great Recession? So knowing this information also helps to define the housing needs of your community. Who has access to homeownership opportunities? Who may not, depending on the hotness of the market and their income levels. Let's move on from housing now to economics. There is another source of data from the census, but it's not on the data portal. It's US Census on the map. It's on a separate site, and it's powered by data that speaks to the number of jobs which are held by residents of a community, and also the number of jobs that are within a community, which may be held by residents or non-residents. So and the data source is called the Employment Household Dynamics Dataset. It's great. It allows you to do some comparisons. So like here on this slide, I'm showing you on the left a table that lists all the different sectors and the share of residents in Mamaroneck who were employed by that sector. But then in the slide beside it, I'm showing you something different. I'm showing you the jobs that are located within Mamaroneck and the sectors that those jobs represent by share. And they're not the same thing. And being able to toggle back and forth and say, why is it that most of my residents are working in this sector, but most of my jobs are in this sector? It might reveal some changes you want to make in terms of your economic development strategy or your housing strategy. If you've got a lot of folks who are working in critical sectors, but for various reasons, they're not, even though they're working in your community, contributing to key parts of the economy, key parts of service delivery, maybe they can't afford housing in your community. And so you want to see this type of breakdown by using the data from the US Census on the Map function. Very user-friendly site, very short learning curve to be able to generate tables like this. And it does more than that. It also will create graphics for you, showing you the number of folks here who are coming in a community to work versus those here, 123 people who are both living and working in a community versus the people who are living in a community but working elsewhere. Here it's just over 4,000 people live, here in Mamaroneck, and they're working elsewhere. And again, this might reveal different types of needs you may have in terms of housing or transportation or your economic development strategy. I also like on the map data because it provides demographic information about your workers. And so I'll let you go through these statistics on your own, but it's really helpful to know what the racial composition is of your workers who may be living elsewhere, and compare the racial composition or the gender composition or the income levels of those workers against those who are residing in your community. It starts to let you think about different economic equity issues. And this data is on the map, and I encourage you to explore it. Lastly, in terms of economic data, be sure to capture unemployment statistics. These are really easy to grab from the New York State Department of Labor data dashboard. You just plug in the name of your community. It'll let you know what the current unemployment rate is, what the historical unemployment rate is. You can compare how your community is performing against other communities. It will generate a graphic showing you over time how that's changed. Now we'll shift to talking about transportation. So step one, you're going to want to find out what is the level of access that your community has to other job centers, how that access is created in terms of regional rail and roadway connections. One way you can do that is to just simply go on Google Earth. You could also do this on Google Map. I suggest you do this through Google Earth. Take a look at the transportation network, see where there might be some ruptures, where there may be disconnections in the region, places in which your community is not well served by the existing transportation network, and where there needs to be, or there could be, a stronger connection in terms of road or railway access. Next, think about how people are getting to work, the mode of transportation they're using. This is data that you can pick up from the census. It might reveal some of the unique needs for public transportation improvements. And you're able to compare how your community is traveling to work, the mode that they're using, to other communities. Here we're comparing the city of Newburgh and Orange County, and not dramatically different, but some variations in terms of the level of automobile dependency. And on that topic of automobile dependency, take a look too at what are the number of vehicles that households have. You can grab this also from the census. And if you're in a community with a very low number of vehicles per household, maybe it might correlate with really high levels of public transit access to job centers in a very urban area. But it might also mean that segments of your population, especially lower income segments of your population, may really be at a disadvantage in terms of being able to access job opportunities due to the dearth of vehicles that they have access to. And so that's a need. Let's talk about social service needs. This is so routinely left out of revitalization planning, and it's really unfortunate because even though, yes, revitalization planning is about investments in infrastructure and real estate development projects and land use changes, it's also about all of the stuff that makes a life in terms of childcare and food and access to legal services, access to clothing, vision. And we can't just assume that everyone in your community has full access to these needs. It's not so easy to quantify. You can grab certain information like food stamp data or or homeless population data from certain federal sources. But ultimately, you probably need to conduct an original survey of your population and get a sense of what the social service needs are for which population groups and what are the barriers. How have folks been trying to access some of these types of needs and not able to do so? And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send you samples of surveys that I myself have crafted. There's not the greatest information online on the best way to craft a survey or even particularly great examples of it, but I would say it's important to do in terms of measuring a need that is often not available in a ready to go data set. Some information you can get. For example, you can find out what percentage of your population has health insurance. And, you know, this is a graphic showing in Western New York, the great variation geographically in terms of communities by census tract, which do have health insurance and which ones are communities that have lower amounts of healthcare coverage, which affects many things, including our access to preventative care or medical information or vaccinations. So you'll also notice that this information was mapped, and I think it's a pretty nice map, and it was generated instantly by the US Census data portal. This was not done by a GIS technician with 2 years of graduate studies in urban planning and spatial science. It was generated within seconds from the US Census website, and I've put the link here to the training webinar on how you too can generate these maps painlessly and quickly. Also, you can map from the census site access to the internet at home. And I like this statistic when I am working in communities with that are more weak in terms of their socioeconomic position. Whether or not there's internet at home affects employment access, educational access. It affects the way kids perform in school. And the map I'm showing you here shows the percentage of households with home internet. And you can see how there is tremendous variation across New York State between downstate and upstate in terms of home internet access. And it might lead to some thinking about how to close that digital divide, how to create more universal digital access as part of a project once you understand the magnitude of that need, the location of that need. The needs of children. And here I'm not just talking about the quality of schools. I'm talking about the full spectrum of activities and resources from children, including recreational program, sports facilities, mental health counseling, substance abuse guidance, social activities, opportunities and spaces for congregation. And this is not information that is easily found in a data set. There are school districts that have done community needs surveys for their school age population. I'm not sure I would recommend that entirely. Some of the issues affecting children at the high school level are very sensitive in terms of children experiencing bullying, or if there are racial tensions in the school, or the unique needs of the LGBTQ community. One of the things that Tiffany and I have done in many of our communities is we've facilitated very interactive engagement sessions in the schools, partnering with principals, doing urban planning exercises with kids. You can work too with your youth leaders, whether they be principals or teachers. Talk to them, talk to guidance counselors, talk to pastors, talk to youth empowerment leaders. Try and find out what their direct experiences with children have been like, the types of issues that children are reporting. And those issues too are all part of revitalization planning, addressing those issues proactively, ensuring that there's programs and spaces available to meet those needs. And we start that by measuring the magnitude, the location, and the type of needs of different children of all different age groups. Public safety, you want to know how much crime is occurring in your community, you could call your police department. Sometimes it's really easy to just call the police chief and get the data, but know that you've got a really handy data source in the New York State data portal's stream crime index, and that will kick out data at the community level showing you the trend data for different types of crime. And this could signal the need for different types of interventions in terms of public safety and security, and also help shape your understanding about the perceptions of crime in your community. On environmental needs, there are some great resources out there that will help you identify the unique environmental assets and the needs of those assets in your community. So from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, they have a interactive mapping tool called the Locator. It's great. It shows you the locations of wetlands, remediation sites. Some of you may be in communities with a lot of brownfield sites and wanting to know where these sites are. It would reveal to you where there may be environmental justice areas where the concerns of EJ are especially important. And being able to, here's a map that I did of Suffolk County, and which you can look at this later, but it shows you the boundaries of the wetlands areas. You can click on those areas and get more information about the characterize that particular environmental asset. A little bit confusing, but it's not the only interactive spatial analysis mapping tool from DEC. There's also the Environmental Resource Mapper, which provides somewhat overlapping information, but also some unique data sets on unique environmental assets, including areas where there may be native habitat or the base flood elevation, but adjusted for sea level rise. So I recommend that you use both of these tools and look at your community and play with the layers here and get an understanding of what are your different environmental assets that need preservation, protection. And these types of maps can also be a tool for understanding where you may need to be more restrictive in terms of development planning, where you may be inhibited. And while the DEC sites are great, I also recommend you take a look at the interactive map from the New York Natural Heritage Program. Again, link is on the earlier slide as sources. Great tool for identifying protected areas, whether because they are formal conservation areas or under some type of easement. Handy tool. What if you want to know what are the needs in terms of water quality? Do you need changes in terms of infrastructure or different approaches managerially to the cleanup? How clean is your water? Well, you could go to the water authority that manages your water, or you could go to the New York State water quality map and instantly get the boundaries of your drinking water district. And it'll link you right to the latest and greatest drinking water reports so that you can see what's going on in terms of your community's access to safe drinking water. A lot of the communities that Tiffany and I work with are really concerned about flooding and the resiliency of their communities to be able to weather literally the extreme storms of the future, cope with the effects of climate change, inclusive of sea level rise. And I am aware that our information on flooding patterns is limited. And yes, we have access to the FEMA federal website and can look at the FEMA flood maps. But we do know that those maps are outdated, and yes, they are being revised. But we need information about the threat of flooding that is more responsive to current conditions and anticipatory of the effects of climate change and sea level rise. New York City recently published a new set of flood maps. This one here I'm showing you is showing you storm water flood projection areas based on a 2080 sea level rise forecast. And obviously, New York City is not all of New York State, and I wish we had this for all of New York State. More information is going to be coming out of FEMA and maybe from other localities about where we are truly at flood risk, and also from academic institutions and from NYSERDA. But in the interim, especially if you're in a small community, I would advise you to work closely with your public works folks and document flood incidents, the magnitude of them, the frequency of them, the location of them, and begin to understand how those different flood incidents might shape the approach eventually that you need to take in terms of conservation and land use development. And we're approaching the end here. Just a few more examples. Cultural needs, you've got from New York State Data Portal, a very handy mapping tool that will instantly show you where you've got sites and districts, places that are formally registered as historic places. Good to know, especially if part of your strategy for revitalization comes to be about harnessing your unique architectural and cultural heritage. And then recreational needs here. This is a map that I generated out of that DEC locator tool that I mentioned to you earlier. And it shows you where there's recreational assets like trails or fishing areas or boat launches, picnic areas, snowmobile trails, a whole gamut. And then you can click on them and you can find out more information about that particular recreational asset. And for so many of the communities we have upstate that are proximate to beautiful natural areas, this type of mapping can really help you think about, well, do we have the right provision of amenities and access points to the natural resources we have? How are we managing visitor needs with our available recreational amenities? And maybe, you know, as part of broader thinking in terms of economic development strategies for tourism, or alternatively for environmental conservation, this type of mapping could be really helpful. And again, very easy to generate and to be able to pick the different layers on recreational assets and amenities, specifically outdoor ones. If you're looking for more indoor ones, that may be a little trickier. You know, your ice skating rinks and your movie theaters and your museums, you may not have access to a great data set, and that may need to come from more anecdotal information. So finally, we've reached step 6, and this is about the creation of the community needs assessment. So I want to leave you with 6 tips. First, compare your data findings with that original brainstorm session. Make sure you have not left a need um, off the table. Uh, take the simplest approach to presenting the data for the first draft. Uh, put it in a PowerPoint. Do not worry about fancy original mapping or infographics. You want to just make sure that you take a broad approach first, and then later on you can get into the presentational. You may be tempted to write everything up and put it in a beautiful narrative report. Don't start with the slide deck as your means of distributing drafts on the community needs assessment. And then when you're ready to invest the time in writing it up, then you'll do that. Keep it at a manageable length. If you go on too long, you may render your assessment useless because there will be a disincentive to absorbing it and reading it. So be judicious about the needs that are most relevant to your community. As I mentioned earlier on, make sure you interpret it. This is where the ready-mades are a little bit limited, right? Because you might look at a ready-made community profile from the American Census and think you're done. But really what has to happen is that you draw the connections between the data and community needs, that you think interpretively, analytically about it. And then lastly, go back to your community one last time, show them what you came up with the CNA, see if it coheres with their own understanding of needs, see if you've missed anything, validate your findings from the quantitative analysis, triangulate them, and then you will be able to have a nuanced community needs assessment. And I put a link here for an example of a CNA that I recently did for a community action agency, just if you want to see a template and an example of one that was done recently from beginning to end. And
All right, so before we get into questions here, we just want to remind you all that there are 3 webinars remaining in our series. On August 22nd, we'll have our placemaking strategies and early project identification webinar. On August 24th, we'll have our project development webinar. And then lastly, on August 29th, we'll wrap up with the implementation of a revitalization plan. So if anyone has any questions, if you could go ahead and put those in the chat now. And just as a reminder to everyone, with all of these webinars, the presentation and presentation slides will all be posted on our New York Forward website for future reference. All right, I'm not seeing any questions yet. We'll do maybe just one last call for questions here. All right. Well, seeing none, thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Thank you.